Hey everybody, a few days ago, Gavin Ortlund posted a video on YouTube engaging with a couple of videos of mine talking about the lack of monotheism in the Bible, both in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament. And that video clocks in at a little over 21 minutes, which is normally longer than I will reply to, but I thought it was a very respectful and a very thoughtful video. And so I think it merits reciprocation in kind. And so I'm going to be responding. This video is going to be longer than the videos I normally publish on YouTube. And if you're watching this on one of the portrait orientation apps, I'm almost certainly going to have to divide it into at least two different parts. But Gavin, as is my custom when I begin responses to other creators' videos, all right, let's see it.
Dan McClellan argues that there is no monotheism anywhere in the Bible. Dan applies this to the entire Bible, including the later portions of Isaiah and the New Testament. Now, in this video, I want to propose that the Bible speaks of other gods primarily in two ways. So when you have language of other gods in the scripture, we're focused mostly on the Old Testament, then we'll get to the New. It usually means one of two things. Number one, foreign idols that the text makes clear don't actually exist, or the text implies that. I'll work through that. Or spiritual beings that are traditionally called, what in Christian theology, angels and demons.
So we're going to get deeper into the weeds of this argument further on in the video, but here I want to point out that this reduction of the use of Hebrew terms for deity in the Hebrew Bible to either references to idols, which are understood to not actually be divine, or to spiritual beings that we would classify as angels or demons, strikes me as a bit reductive and simplistic, but also probably heavily influenced by the work of Michael Heiser, particularly his book, The Unseen Realm, where he makes the case that the Hebrew word Elohim designates entities that exist in a spiritual realm, but probably also some other publications of Mike's as well. And Mike and I went back and forth on this for quite some time on blogs, and Gavin is going to share a bit of one of those blog posts. We went back and forth in conferences that we were both participating at and also in person. And Mike is of the position that the conceptualization of deity doesn't really change throughout the Hebrew Bible. And the majority of Hebrew Bible scholars, myself included, are of the opinion that the conceptualization of deity changes quite a bit. And so the notion that uses of the Hebrew term Elohim are one of these two things, I would suggest presupposes univocality and kind of flattens the synchronic change that we see evident throughout the Hebrew Bible, and suggests that all of it can be characterized by these ideologies, these conceptual frameworks that I have argued in a variety of places are actually products of post-exilic, particularly Persian period and Greco-Roman period ideological innovation. And there are three places where you can freely access my scholarship on this. For instance, the master's thesis that I wrote at Trinity Western University is freely available on my link tree that is called You Will Be Like the Gods, the Conceptualization of Deity in the Hebrew Bible in Cognitive Perspective, where I use cognitive linguistics to try to determine how the authors of the Hebrew Bible are understanding and using the word Elohim, the word Eloah, the word El, what they mean by that. And then my doctoral dissertation, which was written through the University of Exeter, is also freely available at my link tree. That is Deity and Divine Agency in the Hebrew Bible in Cognitive Perspective. And that brings in the cognitive science of religion to talk about how concepts of deity develop cognitively, and then also brings in cognitive linguistics to further interrogate the way the words for deity are used in the Hebrew Bible. And then I also bring in concepts of divine agency. And then I significantly shortened that and edited it for my first book, Adonai's Divine Images, a Cognitive Approach. And that is also freely available through my link tree. So if you would like a full accounting of what I think is going on with deity in the Hebrew Bible, you can check out those three pieces of scholarship.
So those are the two primary usages for the other gods in the Bible. Now, there are others as well. For example, you can find human beings called God or Elohim, like Samuel is called Elohim by the witch of Endor when speaking to Saul.
So what seems to be inadvertently omitted from this reference is the fact that this is the deceased Samuel. This is the ghost of Samuel, and as I discuss in my doctoral dissertation and in my monograph, Adonai's Divine Images, the deceased were frequently identified precisely as Elohim, as gods, because the conceptualization of deity and the conceptualization of the deceased significantly overlapped. And this is what led to things like ancestor worship. And this is also why the temple worship that we see described in the Hebrew Bible has significant overlap with the ancestor worship that we see denigrated in the Hebrew Bible, but also preserved in the mortuary remains that we find in ancient Israel and ancient Judah. And for a wonderful discussion of how ancestor worship worked, I would highly recommend Carrie Sonia's book, Caring for the Dead in Ancient Israel.
You also find the word Elohim used in some other ways, like for divine attributes. But in any definition of the word Elohim, the relation of the God of Israel to all other Elohim is nothing like the relationship of the Broncos and the Raiders. The Broncos and the Raiders are both football teams. One might be better than the other, but it didn't create the other, and it doesn't enjoy the kind of absolute supremacy that the God of Israel has over all other gods.
So again, we're going to get deeper in the weeds later on, but I just want to point out that all the rhetoric that we find in the Hebrew Bible that is going to be appealed to as evidence that Adonai was conceptualized as, according to Mike's term, species unique, or as different in kind and not just in degrees, is the rhetoric of incomparability that can be found in the literature of ancient West Asia, going back 1,000 years before the Hebrew language even existed. It is not different from the rhetoric that is used of other deities, and that rhetoric that is used of other deities is never interpreted as manifesting a conceptualization of the deity that is being addressed as species unique or as different in kind rather than just in degrees. And the first example I want to use is the great Cairo hymn of praise to Amun-Re. I'm taking the translation from the context of scripture, and this text comes from, I think the oldest version of it comes from a statue from the second intermediate period between the 12th and the 17th dynasties, but our best preserved version, which is probably what this translation is mostly based on, comes from the reign of Amenhotep II, so somewhere around 1400 BCE. And I want to start in the lower left, and this is a lot to read, but I'm trying to make a point here that the Hebrew Bible has nothing on the rhetoric of incomparability that we find in other places like this hymn. You are the sole one who made all that exists, one, alone, who made that which is, from whose two eyes mankind came forth, on whose mouth the gods came into being, who made the herbage for the herds, the tree of life for the sun folk, who made that on which the fish live in the river and the birds flying through heaven, who gave breath to the one in the egg, who vivifies the son of the slug, who made that on which the gnat lives, the worm and the flea likewise, who made the sustenance of the mice in their holes, who vivifies the winged creatures in every tree. Hail to you, who did this entirely, one, alone, with numerous arms, who spends the night watchful while everyone sleeps, who seeks what is useful for his flock, Ammon, enduring in all things, Atum, Horakti, praise to you, as they all say, jubilation to you, because you have wearied yourself with us. Let the earth be kissed for you, because you have created us. Hail to you by all flocks, jubilation to you by all foreign lands, to the heights of heaven, to the breadth of the earth, to the depths of the ocean, the gods bowing to your majesty, exalting the might of him who created them, rejoicing at the approach of him who begot them, saying to you, come in peace, Father of the fathers of all the gods, who suspended heaven, who laid down the ground, who made what exists, who created that which is, sovereign, life, prosperity, health, chief of the gods. Let us adore your might, inasmuch as you have made us. Let us act for you, because you have borne us. Let us give you jubilation, because you have wearied yourself with us. Hail to you who made all that exists, Lord of truth, Father of the gods, who made mankind, who created the flocks, Lord of grain, who made the life of the desert flocks. Ammon, the bull, beautiful of face, beloved in Karnak, grand of appearance in the mansion of the Ben. And it goes on like this. So this is rhetoric that is well known from before any syllable was ever written down for the Bible. And we also have other references to these deities being the ones who created the other gods, creating all the other gods and being highly exalted above them is standard rhetoric in ancient Southwest Asian literature and is not an indication of species uniqueness. If you want to make that argument, you've got to find some way to demonstrate that the rhetoric as found in the Hebrew Bible is qualitatively distinct from the exact same rhetoric that we find in literature that long predated the Bible.
So really, whether you call this monotheism is a matter of terminology, because we can speak of other gods if by that you just mean angels and demons and so forth. It's true that the Bible, in other words, put it like this: the Bible doesn't have like a philosophical monotheism, but in less technical language, it has what amounts to a monotheism. That's the case I want to make here.
So this is very true and very important. It comes down to what we mean by the word monotheism. However, this just raises that observation without engaging the concerns that have been expressed by myself and by others for the way the concept of monotheism has been revised and redefined for no other reason than that that is necessary in order to find it in the Bible. Because if you're going to say, I think monotheism is in the Bible, well, the Bible acknowledges the existence of other gods. Oh, well, I'm going to come up with a new way to understand what monotheism is. That's just an ad hoc revision of the definition precisely to serve the rhetorical goal of finding monotheism in the Bible. Where does the concept of monotheism come from? What has it historically been used to refer to, and why are people now revising the definition? This is something that I addressed in a paper that I presented at a conference that I helped organize almost a year ago at Brown University, a paper that will be published in an upcoming edited volume that I will be helping to edit. I also discuss it in an entry in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Religion that will be published in the next month or so. This is a serious question that is not really given any time in this video, but needs to be addressed. When we look at the development of the concept of monotheism, the word was first created in the 17th century. It was coined by a Cambridge Platonist, a philosopher named Henry Moore. And as I point out in the presentations in the papers that I've written on this, it was used not as the product of some kind of critical interrogation of the religious traditions of the world, but as an identity marker and a value judgment, as a way to distinguish good religion from bad religion, which is why Moore says, oh, the Muslims, they have a false monotheism, a hypocritical pretension to monotheism. And then the materialists who said there is only one deity and it is the material world, he said, that's not even a real deity, so that doesn't count either. So it wasn't really about the number of deities, it was about the nature of the deity. Did it qualify as actual religious belief and actual deity according to the beliefs of Christianity? So it was about distinguishing us from them. Historically, that is how the word monotheism has been used. Then it was picked up by the deists in the 18th century, and they actually suggested that only the Unitarians were real monotheists, that Trinitarians were not actual monotheists. Webster defines it as this belief that there is only one God, and that is an etymological fallacy, because that's never how the term was actually used. It has always been more about the nature of the one God being worshipped than the number of the gods. And then since then, it has been further revised in recognition of the fact that other gods are mentioned throughout the Hebrew Bible and even the New Testament. And now more recently, we have scholars who are massaging the definition even more. Scholars like Larry Hurtado, scholars like Benjamin Sommer, who want to be able to maintain the identification of monotheism in the Bible, whether the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, not because the way the term has always been used can be applied to the Bible, but because we need to preserve that ideological continuity between the communities that produce the Bible and the communities that are using that term today. It's a highly problematic way of going about trying to understand what monotheism is.
So let's work through this. First, let's talk about cases where the biblical language speaks of other gods, but makes clear or implies that they're not real. The biblical text has a range of different rhetorical strategies for expressing the unreality or the ontological non-existence of other entities, sometimes called gods. Some of this rhetoric comes in the context of their destruction or death. For example, in 2 Kings 19, we read that the kings of Assyria have laid waste the nations and their lands and have cast their gods into the fire, for they were not gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore, they were destroyed. So the logic here is these gods are actually not gods. They're just wood and stone, and therefore they can be destroyed.
So this is actually overlooking a point that Gavin is actually going to make toward the end of the video in engaging Paul's rhetoric. That rhetoric is not saying the gods of the nations aren't really gods because they can be destroyed. What that rhetoric is saying is what they refer to as gods are actually just idols, the work of human hands, wood and stone, and they can be destroyed. Paul says the exact same thing. An idol is nothing in the world. But the idol, while it can be identified with the deity, is not the fullness of the deity. It does not exhaust the presence, identity, or being of that deity. It is just an index. It is just material media to reify or manifest the presence of the deity, because it is representing something else that is elsewhere. And that is the actual God, and that cannot be destroyed because that is not the work of human hands. So this is part of a layer of rhetoric that we refer to as idol polemic in the Hebrew Bible. What this rhetoric is not saying is that a deity like Baal or Chemosh or Asherah is exclusively identified with an idol, and therefore, because it's the work of human hands, it's not an actual god and it can be destroyed. Therefore, there's no actual Baal. There is just this piece of material media that can be destroyed. That's what Gavin seems to be suggesting, that that's the way these deities are being addressed. But this is a rhetorical layer in the Hebrew Bible that comes from the exilic and post-exilic periods, known as the idol polemic. And it's just polemicizing the idols. The authors of these texts know that those are just material media that index the actual deity that is understood to exist elsewhere. In fact, that's precisely what Paul says when he says, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, but then goes on to point out that when they're worshiping idols, they're actually worshiping an entity that is distinct from the idol, which Paul dismisses as gods that they did not know. The same understanding existed when Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and this passage in 1 Kings, and many of the other passages to which Gavin is going to appeal for this part of his argument, were written. They knew that the idol was not exhausting the identity of the deity. They knew that the idol could be referred to as the deity because it was understood to manifest the presence of the deity, and they were denying real deity to the idol, not to the deity it was supposed to index.
Another way to describe the unreality or non existence of the idols of the nations is to emphasize their utter impotence to act or to perceive. So, for example, Psalm 115 has this powerful contrast that our God is in the heavens, he does whatever he wants, but their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak, eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear, noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk, and they do not make a sound in their throat. Now, to say that an entity is mute, blind, deaf, unfeeling, immobile, and silent, if you list up all those different descriptions from Psalm 115, is a rhetorical way of saying it's not real. Psalm 115 is not saying, well, Dagon and Marduk and Moloch and Baal are out there, they just have all these handicaps. This is a rhetorical way of saying what 2 Kings 19 said and 2 Chronicles 32 said, that these are the gods that are not gods. They're the work of men's hands. Human beings made them, but they're not real.
So same thing here. This is just idol polemic. It is denying real deity to the idol, not to the God that the idol indexes. And as I discuss in my master's thesis, in my doctoral dissertation, in my first monograph, the Hebrew Bible itself will also talk about material media as actual deity. It's doing the same thing that the authors that are being denigrated by these rather late literary layers in the Hebrew Bible are doing. And we see the exact same thing in terms of the Ark of the Covenant, for instance, which is associated with the actual presence of the deity and can be referred to as if it is the deity. And I address a variety of examples in my doctoral dissertation and in my first monograph.
And this contrast between the God of Israel, who can show up and act and do things, versus other pagan deities who are mute and deaf and blind, is dramatized in the Old Testament narrative. Famous example, this is a kind of a motif all throughout the story of Israel. But a famous example is the contest between Elijah and the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings 18, where you can see how Elijah frames it in verse 24. It's not about which is the stronger deity, like the Broncos might defeat the Raiders in a game by scoring more points than them. The question is simply, who is God? And you can see the response of the people after the fire falls from heaven, that it's the Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. It's not that Elijah summons a greater amount of fire than the prophets of Baal. It's that the prophets of Baal have no fire. And so when they're dancing around the altar, Elijah is mocking them, as I've underlined in red here, saying, well, maybe he's going to the bathroom, maybe he's traveling, maybe he's asleep. And this sounds kind of like Psalm 115 and the rhetoric here about the idols of the nations being blind and deaf. Twice the text states what I emboldened here in green, but there was no voice and no one answered. The point of the narrative seems to legitimize the Israelites' reaction that the Lord is God because Baal can't hear you. No one's paying attention to the prophets of Baal. In the language of Psalm 115, he's deaf and mute. So it doesn't seem like Baal is simply the inferior deity. It seems like he's not capable of agency, which implies his non-existence.
So I would say this is also not adequately engaging with the critical scholarship on this contest. And part of this is an artifact of engaging the text in English translation. Because when the people cry out, they don't say he is God. They say Adonai hu ha Elohim. He is the God. He is the God. And while this may seem like splitting hairs, it is important to note that what is at stake here is not which God exists, but which God has the appropriate type of power for this people in this region. And what is the type of power? Storm deity power. Asking fire to come down from heaven is asking a storm deity to demonstrate that they have sovereignty in that area, because Adonai's purview overlaps with Baal's purview, both regionally and in terms of their divine profile, because Baal is the Northwest Semitic storm deity. What is Adonai? A storm deity. Both of them try to assert the title rider of the clouds or charioteer of the clouds. Psalm 29 appropriates poetry that was likely originally dedicated to Baal. And how do we know this? We have this sevenfold Kol Adonai. The voice of Adonai is like thunder, is like lightning, is like all these things that are associated with the storm god's power. But then it talks about three different locations in Psalm 29 that are not associated with Israel. They're further north. They're locations associated with the Northwest Semitic storm deity Baal. And so there's this constant conflict between Adonai and Baal because they're both trying to assert the same divine profile. And so the question here is not which God actually exists, it's which God is the storm deity, Ha Elohim, in this region. And how do we know whose purview covers this region? Well, we see which one can bring fire down from the heavens, lightning, a feature of the storm deity's divine profile. And so it's not saying Baal doesn't exist. It says in Adonai's inheritance, the nation of Israel, Adonai has sovereignty. This is the purview of Adonai as storm deity. And we see other parts of the Hebrew Bible where Adonai goes outside their purview and loses. 2 Kings 3 is probably the most interesting example. That is where Adonai promises victory, full, complete, unilateral victory. I will give the Moabites into your hands. For this coalition, this Edomite, Israelite, Judahite coalition that is going to go into Moab to punish the Moabites for throwing off vassalage to Israel. And what happens? Right as they're going to win, the Moabite king offers his son, an heir to the throne, as a human sacrifice on the city wall. And the very next thing that the text says is there was great fury against Israel, and they packed up and left. Mission failed. They did not fulfill the prophecy. And most scholars who look at this text say, unless we're just going to make stuff up in order to protect our dogmas, the text can only lead to one conclusion. The human sacrifice successfully catalyzed the intervention of the Moabite patron deity Chemosh, who then intervened and drove off the invading force and their deity. The exact same thing that happened to Sennacherib when he invaded later on because of the intervention of Adonai happened when Adonai got out of pocket and lost home court advantage when they invaded the purview of another deity. Every nation was the purview of the deity there. And so the contest of Elijah and the prophets of Baal is not about whether or not the other God exists. It's about whose purview this land is. Who is Ha Elohim, the God, in this territory? And this territory honors a storm deity. And so we have Baal as a storm deity and Adonai as a storm deity. Who can prove that they are the storm deity, Ha Elohim, in this region? Adonai is the one who does it, which means Adonai is Ha Elohim, the God, for us in this region, because this is Adonai's inheritance, as we see in Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9, and in many other places in the Hebrew Bible.
It seems like what we're dealing with here is the same thing as in 2 Kings 19:18, the gods that are not gods.
It's not the same thing. It's two entirely different types of rhetoric. One piece of rhetoric is saying that thing, that object that you identify as a manifestation of the deity is not actually divine. That's just something that we can destroy. What we've got with the contest of Elijah and the prophets of Baal is a question of whose territory this is. Which storm deity has purview over this region?
So when we get to these famous negation texts in Deuteronomy and Isaiah that say there is no other or there is none beside me and so forth, it seems unlikely that this would be only rhetorical trash talk, like the Broncos saying there's no team like us, or the Raiders are nothing, or something like that. Rather, these passages are best interpreted in light of this contrast we've noted between the God of Israel, who can actually do things, and these other so-called gods who can't do anything because they're not real. After all, in these chapters of Isaiah, we find the same theme that idols are nothing, as in Isaiah 41:24. They're just the work of human beings. They're what you can create. Therefore, they can't save you.
So this is slightly different rhetoric, and it is indeed repeatedly hurled at the idols and the deities that they index. However, it is also hurled at other entities. And when we look at how Deutero-Isaiah uses this rhetoric, we can see that it is very clearly not intended to deny their actual ontological existence. It is precisely a denial of their relevance and of their power compared to Adonai. So it is precisely the same as saying the Raiders do not compare to the Broncos. The three Hebrew words that are being used in this rhetoric that is being hurled at the idols and the deities they index are ein, which literally means there is not, but in this kind of context is used to mean something more like nothing. And then we've got apha or ephes, which are synonyms that mean less than nothing. And then we've got tohu, which is being used to mean something like vanity or useless or something like that. Now, it is used in Isaiah 41:24 to refer to the idols, to say they are nothing and they are less than nothing. But let's look at Isaiah 40:17. All the nations are as nothing, ka'ain, before him. They are accounted by him as ephes, less than nothing, and tohu, emptiness or vanity. We can look at Isaiah 40:23, who brings princes to nothing, la'ain, and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing, ka tohu. We can look at Isaiah 41:11. All who are incensed against you shall be ashamed and disgraced. Those who strive against you shall be ka'ain, as nothing, and shall perish. 41:12 says, you shall seek those who contend with you. These are the other nations of the earth, but you shall not find them. Those who war against you shall be nothing at all. Cha'ain u'cha'esef. Nothing and less than nothing. And so when we get to the reference to the idols as nothing and less than nothing, clearly the idea is not to say they don't exist, no more than it is to say the nations around you, these enormous empires of Babylon and Assyria, it's not to say they don't exist. It's to say, yeah, they're huge, they're intimidating, they're there, they're real, but our God makes them look like nothing. So it is precisely that rhetoric of incomparability. It is not saying they don't exist. It says they don't matter because our God is so much greater than they are.
And idols are profitable for nothing, as in Isaiah 44:10. Similarly, in Deuteronomy 4, the whole rationale for the uniqueness of Yahweh is to show that these other deities haven't done these miracles. Did any people ever hear the voice of a God speaking out in the midst of the fire, as you have heard and still live? Or has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation by trials, by signs, by wonders, and by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great deeds of terror, all of which the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? To you it was shown that you might know that the Lord is God, there is no other besides him.
So I don't think it's a particularly great idea to appeal to the rhetoric of Deuteronomy as a defense of the interpretation of the rhetoric of Deutero-Isaiah as denying the actual existence of the other gods, because in Deuteronomy, the existence of the other gods is repeatedly acknowledged and even asserted. For instance, in Deuteronomy 4, we just got done telling the Israelites not to worship the sun, the moon, the stars, the whole host of heaven, which is a very traditional West Asian way to refer to the gods, because they were given to the other nations to worship. They're not for Israel or Judah to worship. And Deuteronomy 4:19 is a later riffing on Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9, where we have the Most High dividing up the nations according to the number of the children of God, among whom is Adonai, who receives as their inheritance the nation of Israel, the land of Israel, which is repeatedly referred to as the inheritance of Adonai in the Hebrew Bible. And so we have the same rhetoric in Deuteronomy 32:39, for instance, this I am and there is no other. But then in verse 43, as we can reconstruct from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from the Septuagint, the other gods are called on directly to worship Adonai. And this is what is quoted in Psalm 97:7. And so the other gods are there throughout Deuteronomy. And this is why most critical scholars who identify Deutero-Isaiah as the threshold of monotheism based on that rhetoric are not so eager to do the same for Deuteronomy, because it explicitly acknowledges the existence of the other gods, which suggests to me and to many other scholars that maybe this rhetoric isn't denying the existence of the other gods. And if you would like a full academic treatment of the question, I would highly recommend Nathan MacDonald's book, Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism, where he demonstrates that that kind of rhetoric is used in many different places, not to refer to any kind of ontological exclusivity or the ontological non-existence, but to refer to proximity or the presence of something within someone's domain, within their purview, or within the scope of rhetorical relevance. And I would specifically recommend chapter 2 of Nate's book, and specifically section 3 of chapter 2, which talks about Deuteronomy 4:35 and 39.
Now, I do agree with Dan that the emphasis of this biblical language is of negation is on the power of the deity. But that has implications for ontological questions, particularly because this language of I am and there is no other is associated with specific powers like predicting the future and apparently, dare I say it, eternality. For example, in Isaiah, it's the God of Israel who is the one who can see the future because no God before me was formed, nor shall there be any after me. I am the Lord, and beside me there is no Savior. I am the first and the last. Besides me there is no God. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning. So I'm trying to read through these passages. I hope I'm not reiterating things in an annoying way here, but point is that the besides me there is no other language is associated here with these specific claims that there was none before me and none after me. You see, this is not a claim that the Denver Broncos could make over another football team. The Denver Broncos didn't exist before and after all the other football teams, but the God of Israel can say, before me no God was formed, nor shall there be any after me.
So, something to note here about the Hebrew. The word that is rendered formed in this translation is the Hebrew root yatsar, which means to form or to mold or to sculpt, as one would do with pottery or with an idol. This is not the language that is commonly used in ancient West Asia to refer to the creation of the gods. It's usually procreation that results in the gods. And so, what this text seems to be saying is those things that are formed with human hands are not gods. They were not there before me. They're not going to be there after me. It's not saying no other gods exist. It's saying that the things that are formed are not actually divine. It is the same old idol polemic that we find elsewhere in Deuteronomy, Isaiah.
Now, Dan brings up that foreign cities like Babylon can also say, I am and there is no other. And that's true. But also, you look what immediately happens to Babylon after she says this, and that's judgment. That's the whole point of this chapter is judgment and doom on Babylon. So Babylon can say in her heart, I am and there is no other, but she's just wrong. It's just a false assertion. And the fact that an evil entity can ape this language doesn't deprive it of its monotheistic implications.
So whether or not the city is accurate is really irrelevant to my argument, because my point is not that the city is right. My point is that it doesn't really make sense for the city to be appropriating that rhetoric if that rhetoric is intended to be understood to mean that no other cities exist. It really only makes sense for the city to be appropriating that rhetoric if the rhetoric is intended to mean I'm the only one that matters to my constituents. Within my domain, my purview, within the rhetorical scope, no other cities matter. Whether the city is right or wrong, that's what the rhetoric would mean when put into the mouth of a city like Babylon or Nineveh or Moab.
So, point so far is that not in all, but in many cases, the gods referenced in the Old Testament are not real. They don't actually exist. They're gods that are not gods.
So I don't think this conclusion has been adequately supported by the argument to this point. There have been two different main types of rhetoric that have been highlighted. One is the anti-idol polemic, which is not denying that other gods exist, but is denying that the idols, the material media that have been created as the channel for the presence of the other deities and can be referred to as if they were the deities, are not actually in and of themselves divine. It's not denying that the gods that they're supposed to represent or index are divine. It's not addressing that. It's just saying idols are not gods. And then the other rhetoric is this I am, there is no other rhetoric, which is more about an exclusive relationship between Adonai and the people of Israel. And as we've seen, this has to do with the fact that Israel is Adonai's inheritance, that is Adonai's purview. And so the people that occupy that purview have nothing to do with any other gods but Adonai, because Adonai is Ha Elohim, the God in that purview. And you can look at Nathan MacDonald's book, Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism, for a full case for that. But one other piece of evidence that I think lends support to that is the Shema. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Adonai Eloheinu means Adonai, our God. And Eloheinu takes a generic noun, God, and identifies it specifically as the one that pertains to us, our God. So this phrase already presupposes the existence of many other gods. Adonai Echad. Adonai is one. What precisely does that mean? Well, the closest analog would probably be Song of Songs 6, verses 8 and 9, where the singer talks about how there are all these other women around, all these other concubines, all these other maidens. But then they say, my dove, my perfect one, achat he, she is one. This is grammatically analogous to Adonai Echad, which is the masculine form of one. And what does this mean? It does not mean she's the only one that exists. We've just acknowledged the existence of numerous other women. She's the only one for me because it's about an exclusive relationship. And so that's the best case that we can make for what this rhetoric means when we consider it within its context and when we take it seriously on its own terms, rather than read into these texts what we want to be there, what we demand the text be allowed to say and not allowed to say.
Now, in other cases, the word gods refers to real entities. However, these entities are created by the God of Israel and are radically subservient to him. In many cases, it's clear that these entities are what Christians have traditionally called angels and demons.
So here we're getting to the part of the argument where we're flattening the synchronic change that occurs throughout the Hebrew Bible over this course of like 1,000 years. And the squishing down of the rest of the Israelite pantheon, apart from Adonai, the God of Israel, into servile, angelic, demonic status is something that occurs in the post-exilic period, into the Persian period, into the Hellenistic period. And I address this in a lot more detail in my master's thesis, in my doctoral dissertation, in my first monograph. So if you'd like more detail, you can go to those texts. You can also check out my article from the Journal of Biblical Literature from 2018 on Psalm 82 called The God's Complaint. And you can access that for free through my link tree as well. But what the argument from here is going to do is take that post-exilic identification of the gods of the nations as angels and then just kind of arbitrarily extend it to cover all of the time that came before without argument. Not going to address the fact that when you appeal to the Septuagint's translation of Elohim as angeli, as angels, you're appealing to an event that took place around the 3rd century BCE. That is not indicative of how the word Elohim was interpreted in the 700 years prior to the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. So this is, I would argue, methodologically problematic and is presupposing univocality, is presupposing a lot of dogmas that can only be read into the text and cannot be critically identified or detected in the text.
And therefore, these beings don't really threaten monotheism proper. Again, here it's just a matter of terminology, if you call them gods or not. But in the scripture, we do seem to have the word Elohim used for angels. A clear example of this seems to be in Psalm 8:5. Most translations speak of heavenly beings or angels for Elohim here. That's how the Septuagint takes it, and that's many other traditional interpretations like Syriac and Aramaic translations, for example.
So again, the notion that this is referring to angels dates to probably around the middle of the 3rd century BCE or after, which is not evidence that Elohim were interpreted as angels in the 700 or 800 years prior to that, all the way back to the earliest possible literary layers that are in the Hebrew Bible.
And in the Bible, angels are created by God. We saw that in Nehemiah 9. They're also subservient to God and obedient to God, as we see in Psalm 103, and as we see in Psalm 91, where God gives commands to his angels. We also see angels worshiping the God of Israel. We saw that in Nehemiah 9. We see that in other texts like Psalm 148 too.
And as we've already seen with the great Cairo hymn of praise to Amun-Re, all of the exact same stuff is said about the other gods in relation to Amun-Re, who were said to be created by Amun-Re and who are said to give praise to and to worship Amun-Re. But if we go back to the Second Intermediate Period or the 14th century BCE in Egypt, we're not going to find something that we would identify as monotheism. We're not going to find this concept of species uniqueness or this notion that there is some kind of qualitative rather than quantitative difference between Amun-Re and the other gods. This is the rhetoric of incomparability, which is identical to the idea that the Raiders cannot compare to the Broncos.
Similarly, we have demons called Elohim in the Bible. For example, Deuteronomy 32:17. I'll just read this. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods, that's the word Elohim, they had never known.
And I think this is right, apart from one thing. I would point out that Shedim doesn't really mean demons. It's a specific class of deity, and it is only traditionally translated as demons because that's how the Septuagint translated it. Again, the translators of the Septuagint around the middle of the 3rd century BCE are trying to interpret this text according to what they understand and according to the Greek terms that are available to them. So they're the ones who take this idea of demon and superimpose that category over the Hebrew word shedim, which, according to earlier Aramaic texts like the Dear Allah inscription and others, suggests that they are classes of foreign deity rather than something that we would now identify as a demon. There's not a really good case to make that the Hebrew Bible has any idea about these things called demons. That's a theological innovation of the Greco-Roman period. I need to make one other point about this verse because of the translation that Gavin is showing on the screen, which has the first clause ending by saying these were demons that were no gods. That makes it sound like the author is denying these demons their divinity, but that's not a great translation. It should actually say to Shedim and not capital G God. In other words, to demons rather than to Adonai, the God of Israel. And for, I think, a very good argument for why that should be the case, this paper by Michael Heiser is a good read.
So demons are called Elohim. And as Dan mentions elsewhere in his video, this same understanding is in the New Testament, where Paul teaches that pagan sacrifices are actually to demons. So for that reason and for others, the Bible does seem to regard demonic powers as lying behind the false gods of the nations. So that even if, say, Queen Jezebel is not conceptualizing what she thinks in her mind about who Baal is not necessarily accurate from the biblical perspective, that doesn't mean that there's no real entity at work in Baalite religion.
So here's that acknowledgement that the target of the idol polemic passages is not the gods themselves, but just this material media that is supposed to channel their agency, their presence, whatever. But this argument has to try to take that Greco-Roman period interpretation of the Shedim and these gods as demons and retroject it over all of the references to the other gods, so that any reference to gods must be either angels or demons. And once again, that is anachronistic. That is a theological development of the post-exilic period. There are no data that support reading that into the references to the other gods that we find in literature that predates that theological innovation.
What that amounts to is that basically, insofar as there are other gods in the Old Testament that are real, these are sometimes just references to what Christians call angels and demons. And these are created beings that don't compromise God's uniqueness and supremacy. Now, this is one possible way to read Psalm 82, which says, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. Because even here, God brings these other gods to death, as you can see on the screen later on in the psalm. Now, this passage is interpreted differently, but the angelic interpretation of the divine council is obviously a theme that Michael Heiser has developed. And I wondered if Dan was drawing a bit from Heiser at points on his website where he talks about these topics, try to represent someone fairly and understand where they're coming from. So I read through his article on this on his website. He talks about how Heiser has the best treatment available of the rhetorical function of these passages in Deutero-Isaiah that we've looked at, and also Deuteronomy, the negation texts I think he's talking about there. But it's worth pointing out that Heiser pushes all this in a different direction, since he has a construal of the divine council that's more focused on angels and demons. So this, again, is just a matter of terminology. Heiser sees the word monotheism as a bit imprecise. Here's how he puts it. Yahweh was an Elohim, but no other Elohim was Yahweh, and never was nor could be. This notion allows for the existence of other Elohim and is more precise than the terms polytheism and henotheism. It is also more accurate than monotheism, though it preserves the element of that conception that is most important to traditional Judaism and Christianity, Yahweh's solitary otherness with respect to all that is in heaven and in earth.
Before we move too quickly past this, I want to point out that this paper that is being quoted here by Michael Heiser makes a really good case that the rhetoric of Deutero-Isaiah and Deuteronomy is not denying the existence of other gods. In other words, Heiser agrees with me here over and against Gavin's argument in the earlier half of this video. And so we look at page 18. Heiser says all these passages, and he's talking about Deutero-Isaiah and Deuteronomy, are transparently concerned with comparing Adonai to other gods, not comparing Adonai to beings that do not exist. That would be empty praise indeed.
So far as I can tell, again, we're just talking about terms, how you define the term monotheism and how you define the term gods. Because Heiser goes on to point out that these other gods referenced in the Old Testament are not coexistent with God. They are not eternal. They were created by him, they are subservient to him, and they worship him. So I think you can see this as a species of monotheism, just using the word God differently. Here's how Heiser puts it. The canonical writer believed the God of Israel alone was sovereign and deserving of worship because his nature was unique, pre-existence, and his power was unquestionably superior, creator of all that is.
And I disagree with Mike there. And as I've already pointed out, all of those things are also said about the other gods in relation to Amun-Re. And that's definitely not monotheism. And as I have already pointed out, Mike wants to argue that the conceptualization of deity in the Hebrew Bible was not constantly changing in response to new circumstances and ideological innovation. I don't think that there's really a good case to make for that. And I make my case in my master's thesis, in my doctoral dissertation, and in my first monograph, and make it even further in this article that will come out in the edited volume about the Conference on Monotheism, and in my article on monotheism for the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Religion.
So at the end of the day, the Old Testament portrays the God of Israel as absolutely supreme. It's not that he's just the only God that matters to us, like Broncos fans might feel about their team versus other teams or something like that. And this is affirmed in many different ways, most of which we haven't even touched on here. There's a lot of other passages that are relevant. Genesis 1:1 is relevant because you have God creating the whole world. Heaven and earth are a merism, meaning the whole world.
So I've addressed Genesis 1:1 and the fact that it does not promote creation ex nihilo in many videos, and my forthcoming book, The Bible Says So, What We Get Right and Wrong About Scripture's Most Controversial Issues, also has a chapter directly addressing both the claim that the Bible says God created the universe out of nothing and the claim that the Bible says there are no other gods.
And then you have other passages we need to work through, like the divine name in Exodus 3 or the Shema in Deuteronomy 6.
And I've already addressed Deuteronomy 6 in this video, and I addressed both Deuteronomy 6 and Exodus 3 in the other publications I've already mentioned, as well as the forthcoming publications that I have mentioned.
There's disputes about those we would need to get into. I'm just sort of flagging those here. I think what we've said hopefully is sufficient to make the point. If you want to see a good taxonomy of various different rhetorical ways that the Old Testament affirms its own kind of monotheism, see Matthew Lynch's article, Mapping Monotheism, Modes of Monotheistic Rhetoric in the Hebrew Bible. I'll try to remember to leave a description of that in the video description. If I forget, you can just Google it and find it.
And the arguments I've presented here in the scholarship I have highlighted here respond to all the arguments that Matthew's article makes.
Real quick to finish, what about the New Testament? Dan quotes Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 8, where Paul himself may be quoting from the Corinthians letter. Therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence and that there is no God but one. For although there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. And Dan once again takes this to probably mean that there's only one God that really matters, or only one God we care about.
And he says, but for us there is only one God, the Father. And while this can be interpreted to mean only one God exists, it's more likely what Paul intended is that for us, only one God really matters. We only care about one God, that is God the Father.
But I think this overlooks the clause, from whom are all things, which is immediately after, which I've underlined here. Yet for us, there's only one God the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist. Now, someone could say that the phrase all things really only means, they could try to qualify that in some way, like only physical things. But elsewhere, Paul speaks of spiritual beings as created through the Son, including, rulers and authorities and so forth. So it doesn't sound like Paul thinks, you've got lots of deities out there, but for us, there's only one God that really matters. It seems like Paul thinks that the God of Jesus Christ is the God from whom are all things and for whom are all things, just like in Nehemiah 9:6, the God of Israel is the one who created all these other quote-unquote gods because they worship him and he made them.
And as I have already demonstrated, that doesn't really mean anything to the question of whether or not they exist as gods. As we've already seen, long before a single letter of the Hebrew Bible was penned, we already had even more emphatic and even more vehement rhetoric of incomparability being directed toward the God who the authors wanted to exalt over all the other gods, even though they were all equally divine. And so this doesn't really address that concern, and it also doesn't address the concern with how we're understanding the concept of monotheism and why we're understanding it the way we are.
For more on monotheism of the first century Jewish context in which Christianity came about and how the Christology of the New Testament relates to that, see Larry Hurtado or Richard Bauckham. They have great treatment of that.
I've addressed the scholarship of Hurtado and Bauckham many times in the past, and will do so again in this forthcoming essay on monotheism for the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Religion. But if you would like a piece of scholarship from another scholar that addresses this, I would highly recommend this paper by Paula Friedrichsen.
And if you want a study of monotheism in pagan belief systems, check out this book. I'll put a link in the description for that one as well.
I think this is a very interesting volume. I would also recommend the more recent one from 2010, but I would also add that a lot of concern has been raised with the use of the category monotheism as the rubric under which all of this is discussed. And I also discuss the idea of pagan monotheism in some of the essays that I have forthcoming.
For the purposes of this video, trying to be brief, sum it up as simplest possible way. Is monotheism in the Bible? Yeah. There's one God from whom are all things and for whom are all things. It's just that we can also use the same word, namely God or Elohim, to describe some of the created beings that he made.
So I think this tries to reconceptualize monotheism as elevating one God above all the other gods and trying to assert some kind of qualitative distinction between that God and the other gods. And I don't think that is how the concept of monotheism developed. I don't think that is historically how the concept of monotheism has been used. I don't think it adequately engages with concern for the essential nature of creation ex nihilo within the historical conceptualization of the concept of monotheism. I think it is an attempt to just renegotiate what monotheism means so that we can maintain the identification of monotheism in the Bible, because we are a part of religious communities that assert dissent ideologically from the Bible, and so must be able to find the origins of those ideologies in the Bible. In other words, we have to have that ideological continuity. So however we need to understand monotheism to find it in the Bible, we will understand it in that way, as long as that means we can find monotheism in the Bible. But I think if we take a critical look at how monotheism has been used and what's in the Bible, I don't think there's monotheism in the Bible. And again, I've published on this a handful of times in the past. Pretty much all of that scholarship is freely available through my Linktree, and I have more scholarship coming out in the future that will make a more thorough case related to how the concept of monotheism has developed, and I will be sharing that as soon as I am able to as well. Thank you, Gavin, for this response. I am happy to continue this discussion if you've got more you'd like to say. And if you think it would be beneficial to hop on a live stream and address this together in real time, I would be happy to do that as well. And thank you, everybody, for sticking around for this slightly longer video from me. And the fit for this video has been LeVar Burton Says Read Banned Books.